All right. Hello, everyone. You can hear me fine? So I am Janice. I'm from the University of Hong Kong postdoctoral fellow, part of Chow's team, and today I'm presenting the mortality patterns under the extreme heat and non-extreme heat UHI scenarios in Hong Kong. And so here's just a brief overview of what we'll be covering today. And before I start, I also want to acknowledge the Research Impact Fund that made this project possible. And so, just a quick background: the UHI effect, or the heat island effect, is known to exacerbate the adverse impacts of heat on human health. At the same time, we know that during extreme heat events, the UHI effect is also further intensified and also may experience spatial variations. However, previous studies have rarely mapped this UHI effect during the extreme heat events, and especially translated these findings into further heat and health related analysis. And so, not accounting for this UHI intensification under heat waves may actually minimize and underestimate the mortality risk that we have under UHI effect. And so, the study objectives of our study was to examine and compare the effect modification of extreme heat and non-extreme heat UHI scenarios on the association between temperature and non-external mortality in Hong Kong in the last decade. And so, a quick overview of our data source and methods. We obtained daily meteorological and mortality data from Hong Kong, and we used a multi-step process comprising of several published studies from our team. So, I'll be sharing what Professor Chao already shared some of these studies. So, the first step was to define the extreme heat and non-extreme heat UHI scenarios for comparison. Secondly, was to map the spatial variation of the urban heat island effect. And thirdly, to use these in order to analyze the temperature mortality associations under the four scenarios. And so we defined extreme heat as three consecutive hot nights with 2 hot days in between, or 2D3N for short. And this was identified as a strong indicator of excess mortality risk, as shown in the previous papers. And for comparison, we had different variations of lesser extreme heat and also non-extreme heat scenarios. So no 2D3N is absence of that consecutive extreme heat scenario. Consecutive HDHN is one consecutive hot day and one hot night as a lesser extreme heat scenario, and then also a no HDHN, which is a removal of all extreme heat scenarios. And so using those scenarios, we then further calculated and mapped the spatial variation. So we used the measure of urban heat island degree hours. And so this measures both the duration of the difference and also the difference in temperature of a selected meteorological station interposed with a rural station. And a spatial mapping was conducted at the Tertiary Planning Unit in Hong Kong, which is one of the small geographical units by the government planning department. And we did this spatial mapping using a land use regression. And similar to what was shown earlier, you can see up top is the map of the UHI during extreme heat events, and the lower map shows those during non-extreme heat events. And so there's a little bit of a color contrast. And so we further took these spatial mappings, and we then weighed across the entire Hong Kong, weighed all of these TPUs by cumulative mortality count, and then classified it into 3 levels of urban heat island degree hours. And so this included the lowest 25% of mortality counts, the moderate 50%, and then the upper 25%. And this was done for each of the four scenarios as mentioned earlier. And then thirdly, we took these and we analyzed the temperature mortality associations under the four scenarios. And so we used distributed lag nonlinear models with penalized spines, as well as generalized additive models with quasi-Poisson distribution in order to do the analysis. And for each model, we analyzed external mortality by a cross basis of mean temperature, as well as adjusted for day of study, day of year, day of week, and holiday. And then separate models, independent models, were analyzed for each of the levels under each scenario, and the minimum mortality temperature was identified, as well as the relative risk calculated in comparison to the MMT. And so here's a quick map of what it looks like when we kind of combined all that processing and all that steps together to see what the distribution of the urban heat island effect in Hong Kong looks like. And so the top map shows what is the effect during the extreme heat scenario, and the bottom three show the non-extreme or lesser extreme heat scenarios. And you can see the yellow in the maps indicate the low UHI areas. Red indicates moderate, and high is indicated by black. And what we found was that under the extreme heat scenario, the high UHI areas were in more suburban new town developments. And so you can see that compared to the urban core. So the black is all scattered further out, and not so much retained in the center of the city, which is, it doesn't look center on the map, but Hong Kong, that's, all the yellow parts are mountains. So there we really started seeing a spatial distinction, right, between the different scenarios. And so overall, in terms of the temperature mortality associations, across all scenarios, we found that moderate and high UHI areas had a significant increase of mortality risk in hot temperatures. However, low UHIDH areas did not have this association. But then we took the moderate and compared it with the high UHI areas. And so when we did that, we found that there was, again, a distinction in the extreme heat scenario. So the blue lines indicate the moderate UHI degree areas, and the red lines indicate the high. And so we see that under the extreme heat scenario, the mortality risk was almost doubled in these high UHIDH areas compared to the moderate, whereas the other three scenarios don't really have that same level of contrast. So just a second to digest. And so this is the same information, but in a more numerical method, just indicating the relative risk of mortality under each of these scenarios. And so you can see that in the extreme heat scenario, the moderate relative risk was 1.05, whereas the high areas had a 1.08, whereas for the other three scenarios, there's not really that contrast numerically. This was for the 99th percentile temperature. And additionally, if you looked at non-cancer mortality instead of just overall mortality, we found an even more extreme contrast. So there were stronger effects for non-cancer mortality. When we stratified by age, we found that the temperature mortality risk was mainly found in those 75 and above, and no significant associations for those 64 and younger, and also those between 65 and 74 did not have significant associations. And these trends remain consistent when adjusted for different air pollutants. And so to summarize, before I move into a quick discussion of the implications of our findings, to summarize our findings is that we found that the UHI effect under extreme heat scenarios led to increased risk of mortality in high temperatures compared to non-extreme heat scenarios. And so under the extreme heat scenario, high UHI areas actually found almost double the risk compared to moderate areas. And stronger effects were found for non-cancer mortality as well as those aged 75 and above. And so in terms of implications, what does our findings mean? First, we would recommend that you factor in the UHI effect into the assessment of heat and health impact. And especially important is to generate an understanding of the UHI based on extreme heat events. So not just the regular summer season, which is often done for a lot of studies, but especially what the UHI looks like during the extreme heat events. Since not only did we find the intensity changed, but also the spatial variation of the UHI effect. Secondly, would be to develop a tailor-made heat health warning system that addresses this UHI-induced heat risk, since this is not evenly distributed within the cities. And so this could look like a heat advisory alert or a warning system that specifically targets the hotspots caused by those high UHI areas. And thirdly, to create community-level intervention strategies that target these high UHI intensity areas, particularly catering to large areas that have large population of or proportion of elderly residents within these districts. And fourthly, we would recommend to prepare long-term initiatives for managing heat waves and health, and especially since we identified that it was not just the urban core that had all these heat problems, but especially under extreme heat events, you would see the problems start being scattered in the suburban new town developments. And so we would really, for our city, we would recommend that more attention is paid to those developments and also, areas of new development, and see how heat mitigation measures can be used in those places accordingly. And so this is just a summary of the references. Thank you very much. This paper has been published, so if you want to scan the QR code to access our paper, and also my contact information is on the side as well. Thank you very much.
Any questions from audience?
Thank you. Interesting presentation. I was wondering if there's a correlation between where the high UHI the areas are and socioeconomic status or other determinants of vulnerability to heat.
Yeah, there's definitely that possibility. In this study, we didn't look into or adjust for that socioeconomic factors. And so there are some of the areas that have the high UHI intensity, if like named here, if you're familiar with Hong Kong, is a more vulnerable population or does have a lower socioeconomic status. But overall, it is quite, I guess, evenly distributed, regardless of which heat scenario you use.
Let me supplement some information. If you refer to the socio-economic factors in all this kind of heat risk analysis, actually you can refer to our paper published in 2019, 2020, specifically for the heat risk mapping. So we do consider the social demographic data, including the social, like the people's income, whether he or she live alone, and also the family members, etc. We running the principal component analysis to identify the critical socio-economic factors for the vulnerability analysis. So that part, if you're interested, you can refer to that paper.
So you would expect the same kind of similar results even after adjusting for spatial distribution of the socioeconomic status.
Thank you for your question. Actually, that is why we work together with local NGOs like the Hong Kong Red Cross. We try to, based on this kind of mapping and understanding, so we can provide better community service, especially for the poor and elderly people. Thank you. Any more questions from audience? Yeah, please.
Chao, I would like to know about this new jobs in the suburbs. Does this difference have to do with the urban morphology also?
Yeah, I believe so because it's usually it's a very condensed area of development, and the surrounding is like mountains and different things that probably don't allow the heat to escape as well. And so the urban morphology really does play into, I guess, the impact of the UHI that appears during the heat waves. Yeah.
Actually, when we map out the UHI effect, we're considering the various kind of built environmental factors, like the land use, the building density, the greeneries, even the traffic volumes. So if you want to know the more details, you can refer to our previous paper. So based on that land use regression model, we can map out this kind of heat hazard, no matter for the UHI effect or for the typical heat wave situation. Thank you.
Any last questions?
Thank you very much for very interesting research. And for decreasing the heat-related mortality, and air humidity, the effect of the air humidity is very important, I think, as well as the air temperature.
Yeah.
So for decreasing the mortality, we should think about decreasing the humidity.
Yes.
So obviously.
Yeah. No, thank you for your question. We definitely do agree humidity will have an impact on health. So far in a lot of studies in Hong Kong, we've adjusted for relative humidity, and we usually haven't. It purely just by adjusting with relative humidity, you don't really find that much of an effect. But we are actually going to do future studies on kind of compound events of both humidity and temperature events, and see if that can distinguish the effect of humidity a bit better. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move